The most commonly used measure in psychology of personality is called the Big Five traits. You can remember what these traits are because the first letter of each of the traits spells the word ocean. So the first trait is called openness to experience, and it describes like how much stimulation you need in terms of new experiences. People who go to college tend to actually be more open to new experiences. The second trait is called conscientiousness. That's basically like how hardworking you are, how orderly you are. The third trait is called extroversion, and that describes how much you need interaction with other people and how much you enjoy interacting with other people. The fourth trait is called agreeableness, and that basically relates to how much you dislike conflict with other people or how much you value having harmonious interactions, which sounds like it might be good, but in reality, in terms of labor market outcomes, oftentimes people who are very agreeable tend to have lower wages. And then the last trait is neuroticism. So that's the only trait that's kind of clearly negative. That means that you have less emotional stability. So sometimes people call it emotional stability instead. And that basically relates to how stable your moods are, whether you have a lot of mood swings. And there are other measures available, but most of the literature focuses on these traits, and they've developed systematic ways of measuring them.
Okay, so despite we use different data from different countries, actually we find a quite consistent gender differences between men and women. So in general, we find females are more agreeable, more conscientious, and more extroverted. But on the other hand, we find men are more emotionally stable. So the only personality traits which is undecided is openness experience, and it really related to your education. But in different countries, men and women may have different education level. So the openness experience is the only personality trait doesn't show a consistency across all different countries.
So this is just something that people are recently looking at. They're a determinant for all different kinds of outcomes, but just recently economists have started looking at how they relate to like job search behavior, wages. And we normally think of things like years of education and labor market experience as being important. But even after you control for those factors, there's a lot of remaining differences between people that was previously unexplained. So we're looking at these personality traits as possibly explaining why some people earn higher wages and some lower wages. And it seems to be that they're related to occupational choices, they're related to working behaviors. And then we know that there are big gender differences as well in terms of, say, wages and labor force participation. So that's why we're also looking at personality traits as possibly explaining gender differences.
So despite this previous exploration about the correlation between personality traits and the labor market outcomes, but most of this previous work is done by psychologists. So they basically study the correlation between these two things. But what we want to do is try to explore a deeper mechanism behind this correlation. So in one project, actually we're using the Australia data and trying to think about the intra-household bargaining model. The idea is that in the data we observe while men are always working in the labor market, but on the other hand, the females may have more different diversified labor supply choices. So, for example, a woman with low income potential may just choose to stay at home and do this home production if she married with a very rich husband or her husband have a high earnings. So inspired by this data observation, we try to build a model to model these household relations. So specifically, we model how people choose to supply their hours in the labor market, whether they want to work or not, and how many hours they want to do this home production. And all these margins may depend on their labor market opportunities, like the job offers they can receive. So we have a few key findings. First, we find the agreeableness is very important personality traits to determine the bargaining power within household. So actually, the spouse who are more disagreeable will have higher bargaining power within household. Put in a different word, they will enjoy more marital surplus within the household. Secondly, we find that the gender wage gap in the accepted wage is smaller than the offered wage. The reason is that the females are actually more selective in their working opportunities, while men are always working, but females are more likely to turn down the wage offers with lower wage rates. Lastly, women are paid differently in their personality traits than men. Like for example, for conscientiousness, on average, females have a higher value, but on the other hand, men get higher return for the same conscientiousness level from the labor market outcomes.
So we did another study using German data where we focused on how personality traits affect job search behavior and look at whether this can explain some of the differences between men and women. For example, we find that women take longer to find a job, they have higher unemployment, they have lower wages, and in our data set, this is despite the fact that women actually have higher education than men on average in the data that we're looking at. So we estimate a model of their decisions about job search, where they get offers arrive and they decide whether to accept them or not. And we find that personality traits are important for their productivity. They're also important for the rate at which new job offers arrive. We also incorporate into the model bargaining behavior between a worker and a firm and find that traits are important in that parameter as well. Specifically, the fact that women are more agreeable appears to hurt them in terms of bargaining. We find that their education is actually more highly rewarded in the labor market than men. So women who have more education actually get more of a return for having that education in comparison to men. But their personality traits receive lower market return than men. And similar to our findings using the Australian data, we find that conscientiousness, like men are highly rewarded for being conscientious and women are not, like even though they are more conscientious on average than men. But on the other hand, men who are agreeable see a big penalty in the labor market for being agreeable, So there are definitely differences in how people are rewarded for their personality traits, and this seems to be important for gender wage differences in labor market outcomes.
So genetics, of course, plays a very important role in this argument. So think of the idea is like how tall you are or how fast you can run. Actually, there will be a large part is governed by your genes. But on the other hand, what we want to really focus is a part can changeable over time. So we are more interested in is there any kind of policies which can change the personality traits and leads to different labor market outcomes. So in our study, more specifically, we want to understand how the educational policy can shape your personality traits and leads to a different labor market choices.
So using the Australian data that we were looking at, an interesting feature of these data is that people were interviewed 3 times about their personality up to 8 years apart. So you can actually see what their traits were before they went to college and after they went to college. And we actually see that some of these traits are affected by going to school. So for example, conscientiousness increases upon going to school or going to college. Also, emotional stability increases and openness to experience increase. But the other traits are not affected. And so if you think about the effects of educational policies, like in our paper we consider a tuition subsidy that encourages people to go to school more. Part of that benefit is going to be that it leads them to acquire more desirable personality traits. And then that receives a payoff in the labor market. So we think it's important not only to consider like effects of education policies on education itself, but also on these other what we call non-cognitive types of traits. So we also look at people's personality traits at age 15 and how much that explains differences in lifetime welfare. We look at both lifetime earnings and lifetime welfare. And the initial heterogeneity at age 15 does explain like about half of the difference in lifetime welfare. for people, but our results are encouraging that at least some policies that we can enact are able to change people's traits, so what they have at age 15 can change. Although we do observe that once people reach about age 30 or so, the traits become very stable. So there seems to be this window when you can change it, and then it's pretty much not changeable, or there may be some gradual age trends, but it's really like this window before age 30 when you could change these traits.